The Lawful by Design initiative seeks to bridge the gaps between private sector-led technological innovation and national legal review processes. Today's launch will feature a panel discussion with esteemed experts from academia, industry, and a non-government organisation, including important perspectives on early legal integration in defence technology development. The format for today is 4 speakers, followed by a moderated Q&A session totaling 1 hour, and we'll get you on your way at 6 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time. I'd encourage you to put your questions in the Zoom chat and indicate to whom the question is directed to. Alternatively, you may put your video on during the Q&A session to ask your question in person. And in the meantime, if you could please check that your mic and camera is off, that would be much appreciated. If you have any technical questions, please direct them in the Zoom chat to the Zoom host rather than to all attendees. And finally, a link to the recording will be available after the event via our newsletter and later on the Article 36 Legal LinkedIn company page. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Damien Copeland, who I'm sure is already quite well known to many of you. Damien, welcome to your own Zoom chat here. Damien's the Director of Article 36 Legal and the founder of Lawful by Design. He's a globally recognised authority on the legal review of emerging technologies, including autonomous and AI systems, a former Australian Army officer with operational deployments across 5 conflict zones and a PhD in the legal review of autonomous weapons. He brings an unmatched technical and legal insight to the regulation of next-generation warfare. Damien's joined today by a panel of recognised experts from academia, humanitarian and industry sectors that will undoubtedly make for a compelling discussion. Welcome to Mr. Laurent Giselle, Dr. Kate Conroy, and Dr. Tristan Perez. It's my pleasure now to introduce each of those speakers in a little more detail. Mr. Laurent Giselle is Head of Arms and Conduct of Hostilities Unit at the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. Very early in the morning for him, where he leads global legal policy on weapons, emerging military technologies, and the conduct of hostilities. With over 2 decades at the ICRC, including legal and diplomatic roles in conflict zones and at headquarters, he's a central figure in shaping how international humanitarian law adapts to the technologies of modern warfare. Dr. Kate Conroy is an adjunct professor at QUT for robotics and a leading global expert on responsible AI and trusted autonomous systems. She currently works in AI safety and assurance for the Queensland Government and is the responsible AI lead, Royal Australian Air Force, CERCAT 5 Specialist Capability Officer. Formerly the Chief Scientist of Trusted Autonomous Systems, Dr. Conroy has shaped national frameworks for AI assurance in government and defence, and her work continues to influence the safe and ethical development of emerging technologies in both civilian and military domains. And finally, Dr. Tristan Perez is Chief Scientist for Autonomous Capabilities at Boeing, where he leads enterprise-wide autonomy projects with a focus on systems behaviour, testing and mission assurance. With a PhD in mathematical control theory and a background as a professor of robotics and autonomous systems, he brings over 25 years of technical leadership across AI robotics and automation on both academic and defence industrial contexts. Over to you, Damien.
Thanks, Susan, and welcome both to the panelists, but especially to everyone that's taken the time to join us for this launch today. It's wonderful to see so many people from such a diverse geographic and professional backgrounds. So the purpose of this launch is to launch the Lawful by Design initiative, which aims to enhance compliance with international humanitarian law in the design and development of new technology weapons through the national legal review processes. So Before I make a few remarks, I'd just like to, as a matter of housekeeping, note that whilst I'm no longer a permanent member of the Australian Defence Force, I'm obliged to note that this presentation doesn't reflect Australian Defence Force policies or views, and they are entirely my own and those of the individual speakers in their either personal capacities or representing their organisations. So the impetus for this initiative really came about from my experience over the last 15 years conducting legal reviews for the Australian Defence Force. And over that time, I've noticed a couple of trends. Firstly, that there has been a consistently low level of understanding and awareness of both the content and the requirements of an Article 36 legal review process, not only within defence broadly, but particularly within the acquisition organisations and within the industry with whom they interact. Despite this low level of understanding, there aren't any real mechanisms to connect those that are in many ways responsible for the development of the technologies and the organisations through to whom they will provide the technologies. And so there's limited ability within defence organisations to articulate their requirements from a legal review perspective to industry in general, who are the originators of much of this technology. It's clear that in more recent times that the reliance on defence industry to originate this technology is increasing significantly. And this increase in reliance is also consistent with far shorter timelines for the procurements of capabilities within defence. One thing that has been a consistent issue within defence in relation to legal reviews is the time in which they are contemplated. And in many cases, legal reviews as a legal obligation occur at the advanced stage of capability acquisition. And so one of the objectives of the Lawful by Design initiative is to address some of these trends by providing a bridge between industry and the military acquisition processes, and to inform industry as to what the requirements are for defence acquisition from a legal review perspective. So the Lawful by Design initiative quite simply has two objectives. One is to encourage industry on a voluntary basis to consider their potential clients' IHL requirements in the design and development of new technologies, particularly those that will enable the use of force, either through autonomous systems or AI-enabled decision tools. In the same way that an autonomous car would not be designed without understanding the road rules in which it's required to operate, it makes sense that systems are designed with a view to compliance with international humanitarian law. The second objective is to encourage national military acquisition organisations to actually put legal review requirements at the forefront of their acquisition processes by requiring evidence of or ability to comply with Article 36 legal reviews at the earliest stages, including during the tender process. So the genesis of Article 36 legal was to help to achieve some of these objectives, and through the Lawful by Design initiative, hope to encourage industry and defence organisations to consider as early as possible the IHL and legal obligations in the design and development of new technologies. One of the ways in which we are seeking to help, and I'm very pleased to be able to announce a collaboration arrangement between Article 36 legal and the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Institute, a Queensland-based non-government organisation, whom we will prepare online electronic self-paced learning courses available to industry and others to enable them to understand in detail legal review requirements. And I think the CEO of HADRI is online here, Mitch, so it's good to see you. Thank you. So, with that, it's my very great pleasure to hand over to our expert panel. I'm delighted that they've given us their time to give us their views. What I've asked each of the experts to do is to address the importance of compliance with IHL in design and development, but each come at it from their particular point of view. So Laurent, clearly from the ICRC, will articulate ICRC's view, followed by Kate, who comes from an academic perspective, and finally Tristan will talk broadly from an industry perspective as to how they approach these issues. So with that in mind, I'll now invite Laurent to make his presentation. Thank you, Laurent.
Thank you, Damien, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting the International Committee of the Red Cross to speak at this event. I'm very much encouraged to see renewed attention by states and by military on the conduct of legal review. We, of course, very much welcome the focus that the discussion on autonomous weapons systems and other new technologies of warfare have brought to the importance of the legal review process, including through events and initiatives like this that we have today and the initiative Lawful by Design that you are launching now. And we are also encouraged by broad stakeholder engagement, like we have also today, to strengthen IHL compliance by integrating legal consideration into the design and development of military technologies. That's very important, and I agree with many of the points that you mentioned, Damien. In light of the rapid technological development, it's critical to consider the framework applicable to the design, development, and use of new technologies of warfare. Of course, international humanitarian law is largely technology neutral and applied to all technologies of warfare, including new technologies of warfare. For instance, IHL rules on weapons, such as the prohibition of indiscriminate weapons and those that cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, equally apply to autonomous weapons and would therefore prohibit current or future autonomous weapons that would have such nature or effects. IHL is, of course, not only relevant for regulating the use of the weapons, means, or method of warfare, but also their development, and that's why we are here today. So incorporating IHL prohibition, restrictions, and requirements at the design and development stage helps ensure that the weapons that are inherently incompatible with IHL are not developed and are not eventually deployed. It provides clarity to developers on the restrictions that should be incorporated at the design stage. A critical step in this regard is, of course, the requirement to conduct legal review of new weapons, means, and method of warfare. That's an obligation for states party to the first additional protocol. In our view, the requirement to carry out legal review of new weapons also flow from the obligation to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. If I could put it this way, how can a state ensure respect for IHL by its own armed forces without knowing that the weapon it deploys and gives to its armed forces can actually be used in compliance with IHL? Of course, as such an obligation, and particularly doing that early at the design and development stage, also helps avoid the cost of developing weapons that would end up being assessed as being prohibited. Legal review have to be carried out for all new weapons, those relying on traditional technologies, but it's of course particularly important, but also particularly challenging for new weapons that relies on new technologies. The international community recognized this back in 2003 at the international conference, where the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Conference, where all states together with the Red Cross movement adopted an agenda for humanitarian action that reaffirmed that, and it's also in the UN Secretary General 2018 agenda for disarmament. One interesting question with regards to the law that needs to be looked at the moment of legal review is, of course, the rules on conduct of hostilities. Because the states need to look at all the rules, but typically rules on conduct of hostilities are applied by military commanders on a case-by-case basis in the battlefield. So it's not the most obvious rules to look at when you do a legal review and when you do the design of a new weapons. However, they may be relevant to the assessment of the legality of a new weapon, and that's notably the case with autonomous weapon systems from our perspective. A commander using autonomous weapons system must ensure that all strikes that the autonomous weapons could carry out throughout the entire area and duration of operations, all those strikes must comply with IHL, and the commanders, the users of the autonomous weapons, must be convinced that's the case at the time of use. So the reviewer must assess whether the design and operation of an autonomous weapon systems, and in particular the autonomy in the weapon's critical functions, so targeting and shooting, still allow the user to comply with IHL rules on the conduct of hostility in the normal or expected circumstances of use. So you need to look at them at the design phase already to make sure then the commander can actually comply with them when it uses. Autonomous weapons that are designed or used in a manner that their effect cannot be sufficiently understood, predicted, or explained cannot pass this test because it would prevent the user from being able to control and limit their effects as required by IHL. Such weapons, therefore, must not be approved by reviewing authorities on the basis that the weapon effect will be indiscriminate. And that's one of the reasons why we recommend prohibiting unpredictable autonomous weapons. But I know that's not the topic of today's discussions. But I think that's important to make the link between those aspects. Now, let me address a few of the challenges posed by new technologies of warfare with regard to legal review. There is a challenge in terms of delineating the scope of the technology subject to legal review, and that may also call into question the adequacy and effectiveness of existing review mechanisms. There is the question of timing that Damien, you already raised, and together with that, the question of whether review must be repeated at various stages of the weapon cycles or even after the weapons have been deployed, in particular when there are new information or deliberately gathering new information, especially for new technologies on how the weapon actually operates, how it is used, and how that can then inform a revision of the weapon cycle. And again, that's more important for new technologies because there is less information available. Generally, legal review should be conducted early in the development of the weapon, and that's what is also underscored in Article 36. I mean, Article 36 as in the Geneva Convention, not only the organization, but because it's in the study and development, and of course, acquisition and deployment. But in the study and development, it is not for no reasons, because it's at that moment that you still have a chance to make sure that the weapon that is being developed consider the IHL requirements. This being said, a system with self-learning mechanism that would rely on AI for that purpose would raise concern with the validity of a legal review that would be conducted before activations, in case the systems may modify itself and change the parameters on which the system was reviewed. For the ICRC, in such situations, a new review is required where the modification of the system through the self-learning mechanism alters the functions or affect the effect of the weapon systems. For example, again, taking autonomous weapons, a new review will be required from our perspective as soon as the modification that is done through self-learning by the system affects how the systems select or engage targets, because that's the critical function of it. In practice, however, such a constant review may not be possible, and it's, however, hard to see how autonomous weapons whose targeting function could change after the legal review and could change during use would not be prohibited as unpredictable. I know there are proposals such as post-deployment reviews or even automated testing, but that raises further questions. Post-deployment with regards to the feasibility and the required expertise in the field for that purpose, as opposed to, in a way, a headquarter legal assessment that is normally done for the legal review. And for automated testing in terms of agency and accountability for the human agency and accountability with regard to the testing mechanism. The existing approach in conducting legal review might require adaptation in relations to identifying the contextual and technical information needed to conduct the review. Of course, the review of the legality is based on the weapon technical characteristic, function, and design-dependent effects, and I'm sure my co-panelists will speak in more detail on that, taking into account a range of military, technical, health, and environmental factors. A critical source of empirical evidence for the legal review comes from rigorous testing and unbiased evaluation. And testing might be challenging to carry out for new technologies of warfare. So we recommend in particular that experts from various disciplines are involved in the review process, which might be, however, challenging to resource, and also to obtain empirical data as much as possible and realistic simulations. But again, as I mentioned earlier, to feedback into the process after it has been deployed and review whether the assessment is actually corroborated by data coming from the use in the field. Now, just as a concluding remark, of course, these challenges must be addressed by state to ensure that legal reviews serve the purpose for which they were devised. At the same time, while robust legal reviews remain essential, they are not a sufficient response on their own to all the concerns raised by new technologies. And in particular, they are not a substitute for states on assessing and potentially agreeing on additional international law where they are needed. The legal review are indeed designed to assess the lawfulness of a new weapon under existing law. But if the law is insufficient to address ethical or humanitarian concerns, the legal review itself cannot be a sufficient response because precisely it looks at existing law, not at whether the law is sufficient. So I know that's again not the topic of the debate, but I think it's important to frame what can be achieved through a legal review. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurent, for your presentation. You raised some very salient points, and I can see that you have already generated a number of questions in the chat, so thank you. We'll now turn to our next speaker, Dr. Conroy, who's going to speak from an industry perspective. So, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Damien. I'm actually going to present from an academic perspective today.
Sorry, academic.
No, you're okay. You're okay. And I also just want to provide a disclaimer that I am here in a personal capacity and what I'm saying here doesn't represent the views of defence. So with that out of the way, thank you so much, Laurent, for your introduction to the considerations with regards to international humanitarian law and contextualising the discussion today. I think what I would like to add to the discussion from an academic perspective and someone who's not a lawyer is a little bit of the journey I've been on, not being a lawyer, to try and understand how can non-lawyers who are interested in achieving better humanitarian outcomes in conflict kind of better understand how law being thought of at the beginning of a design, development or acquisition process can help achieve the ambition that the academics are hoping to contribute to in this discussion. And I also want to situate my comments from the perspective as I've been an academic for a while, and academics often are very concerned about how their research could potentially be involved in the use of weapons. There have been a lot of protests around potentially academic research being used for the conduct of war. And a lot of individuals are very, very concerned that their work might end up somehow being deployed on a battlefield. So it's a very sensitive area for academics to be mindful of. And one of the things that really can assist an academic in their mindfulness and how they engage potentially with different stakeholders or industry or government organisations or militaries would be to understand in the first instance what the military that they are potentially connecting to commits to. So one of the things that's really important to understand is whether, for example, Australia commits to Article 36 reviews of all new weapons, means and methods of warfare. Knowing that is a legal commitment by the country means that when you work with Australian Defence, for example, that's part of their bedrock of obligation. And so if you're going to do research with an organisation like Defence as an academic, that's something that you can have as part of the ethical and legal compass that might help you assess whether what you're doing is something that is appropriate or right or correct or lawful. So knowing what the law is really assistive in understanding what your nation has committed to. And if you're working with different stakeholders like industry or other academics, and they have concerns, but they might have fears and concerns, but not know how to articulate or go about addressing them, having some legal education can help put everybody on a better footing so that these ideas and concerns can be adequately discussed and that the concerns can be addressed potentially in the design, development, research involved with working either for a direct defence customer or, for example, if you're an academic and you're working in agriculture or you're working in disaster relief, and say you're helping design drones to do surveillance to help rescue people after floods, and then the company that you're working with, it turns out that they're also selling those drones to defence, and you're trying to figure out, is that okay for me to continue to do my academic research with this company? It could be part of what you would like to organise with your relationship with the industry to find out, well, what have we done here to think about the use of this technology in dual use scenarios? What kinds of ways are we thinking about human control and human responsibility for the use of the drone in the case of the disaster relief to rescue people from floods? And then how might that technology stack be utilised for different kinds of purposes? Do we have an ethics code for our research with regards to exporting to other nations or other cultures? Do we have any restrictions on what we'd like to do with our drones? And having those conversations can be a really good way at the very beginning of doing these sorts of works, because in the modern day, so much of our technologies, whether they're commercial off the shelf, so we purchase them and putting them together, or if we're designing from scratch and trying to develop a bespoke capability, there are going to be legal issues around the way that we bring together physical kit like drones and the intelligence such as artificial intelligence or autonomous functionality that we might pull together in some of the innovative means or methods of warfare that could be emergent. So that's a little bit of the academic perspective that I'd like to share. Another thing I just wanted to mention to those on the call who are not lawyers is IHL is actually the minimum standard, right? So sometimes people see legal compliance and they're like, oh, compliance, it's going to be really restrictive. It's going to stop us from doing things. If you actually understand IHL and the laws of armed conflict, what you realize is that they're incredibly permissive. Like, kind of, to be honest, when I first found out about them, way more permissive than I thought would be reasonable. So if you're an engineer and you think, okay, I'm an engineer, I'm going to develop a technology that minimizes harms to civilians. So I'm going to create a technology, we're going to surveil everybody in a conflict environment, and I'm just going to automatically choose a setting that will always reduce the harms to civilians. You might think that's the morally right thing to do, because why wouldn't you want to minimize the amount of harms to civilians? Well, it turns out in international humanitarian law, human beings get to determine this thing called proportionality, which means that human commanders have to make an assessment to try not to harm civilians, but certainly, but they also need to think about proportionately how to apply effects to meet a military objective, and they have to justify the way they approach that military objective in the fog of war, where they don't have all information. And so sometimes human commanders need to make decisions that cause harms that are unanticipated, or they do anticipate some harms, they can't control all of them. So the law allows for a great deal of uncertainty in decision making, but needs the human being to be responsible for the decision of the use of force on a case-by-case basis, which means the automatic application of algorithms to just go out and try to do an algorithmic processing to reduce civilian harms is actually unlawful, because we can't remove the human role in a determination of how to apply force. So that human-centeredness of the legal obligation, if you don't know or understand laws, you might get confused, because you might think what the law is just a bunch of prohibitions, because that was probably my assumption when I first came into it. Like, you can't use blinding lasers. They are unlawful. And there is a set of law that are prohibitions. So there's definitely, they exist. But then there's all this other stuff that's about actually empowering humans to apply their ethics, values, obligations and parameters to use their judgment to try and do what is an unthinkable act in a terrible circumstance. And that at the end of the day, human beings have to be responsible for those acts. Then you think to yourself, okay, so then ethics is really, really important here, because the international legal obligations are the minimum standard. We must think of them. And then we need to think about how much we then apply our own normative frameworks ethically on top of those in any circumstance that we're in. So what's the problem if your team doesn't know about the law? Well, here's some. So if your team doesn't know what is obliged for the customer, in this case, let's just use the example of Australia that does comply with Article 36 weapons reviews, you can't make your product fit for purpose, because if you don't understand that's something that Australia has to tick off and make sure that it's appropriate, then they can't buy or acquire your kit. So, and what happens then? So if your customer is law-abiding, you should know the law. And if you don't anticipate legal compliance, then you hold unnecessary risks. So just from a pure business perspective, if you've got a budget and an intent and a plan, and you don't already anticipate it, you could definitely get longer approvals, and you could have unanticipated and expensive design changes. Sometimes your idea might just get lost in the process because somebody who's got legal expertise is going to have to be found somewhere, and they're all struggling with their resources and time. There's never enough lawyers to do the job. So if you can do a bit of the work on behalf of the legal team, get ahead of these legal questions and just read some of the frameworks that the ICIC makes public and available, and get an app on your phone. You can have international humanitarian law as an app. Try that one out. And then you've got a jumpstart as an innovator or a technologist to actually have those conversations ahead of time. And once you know what the law requires, you'll grasp the importance of human-centered design, both in how human operators, commanders, and decision makers use technologies, and in consideration for how use of technologies in their anticipated context of use may affect or impact human beings and the environment. So you understand how the human is located in the consideration of any new weapon, means, or method of warfare, but also in your dual use case where you think you might be making technology for a civilian context only, but it could eventually end up in a weaponized way, you're sort of prepared to have the appropriate levels of human interaction with that stack of technology. So really understanding the empowers stakeholders from the very beginning. It's cheaper. So if you're interested in cost savings, the more you think about the law at the beginning, and by the more, I mean, like, have one workshop at the start. Like, it doesn't have to be that you resource a $500,000 set of actions here. Bring together people who have legal expertise along with human factors experts and engineers and data scientists, right? Just make sure lawyers are present at the very beginning of coming up with the concept, because you will learn so much for the team. You can mark a couple of risks down, and then if you actually track the risks as you develop your concept, then you're able to apply the appropriate risk mitigations and design changes in a reasonable and agile way throughout the technology uplift. And so as you develop your TRL of the technology, you come prepared. So the compliance here is not about starting by making sure you know everything about what you're going to do at the beginning. In this case, first, it's awareness and understanding and literacy in the legal obligations, starting to track those risks and starting to do the hypotheticals and the scenarios for the use of the capability that you're intending, mindful of those legal obligations and asking yourselves, is this likely to be lawful? And if you don't have any expertise in the team that has an ability to speak to that, bring someone in, or more than one, occasionally, and check in with them and do a little bit of homework on the topic. It's so important that we're able to uphold ourselves and our values in what we do. And this is a really good way to do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Some excellent points. The multidisciplinary input to design and development, I think, is an excellent point to make. So with that, I'll turn over now to Dr. Perez, who is coming from an industry perspective. So Tristan, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Damien, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to this group and the forum. I've got some rules of engagement here as well. I will not be representing the Boeing company, so I will make some remarks that are generic for defense industry, and that will apply also as well when we come to the Q&A. So first, I'd like to thank you, Damien, for organizing a forum like this, because autonomous weapons systems are a complex topic. The legal aspects are complex. Kate was talking about some of the ethicals as well. Technologies are complex. And also the use of some of these technologies are starting to trigger some changes in military doctrine. And those changes are also complex. And as we bring in all these different communities together, one of the issues that we have is that we do not all speak the same languages. So I think it's very important, the work that you're doing, Damien, together, I think you mentioned with some of the NGOs in Queensland, in order to provide awareness, for example, to industry as to what are the nuances, challenges from the legal perspective, because sometimes we don't understand those things from the different perspective, whether it's from the military customer, from industry, or from the legal side. I'm going to echo some of the things that Kate mentioned, that for defense industries, it's simply a bad business decision to develop a system that a customer cannot use. So our systems aim to be legal by design. And in industry, we are quite aware of the obligations that a customer has, in particular Australia, in terms of being a signatory of the Geneva Convention and the legal reviews. So what I'll talk a little bit about here from a generic industry perspective is the process that we go through in terms of design, and how do we do that in collaboration and in conjunction with defense. This is something that is sometimes not necessarily well understood, how comprehensive that process is. Normally, I split that process into 4 stages. The first one is the need and specification. So this comes mostly from defense. Defense identifies a particular capability need. And as part of that, that triggers the production of 3 documents that then goes to industry. The first document is what is called the operational concepts document. So this is a very comprehensive document that describes what the product or the system should be from an operational perspective. It makes quite a comprehensive definition of the operational context within which the system is going to be used. And by operational context, in the case of autonomous systems and autonomous weapon systems, it's important to split that operational context into what is called the interventional environment, how the rest of the force does command and control on the system, and then what we call the operational environment. And the operational environment has different components. Some of them are physical in relation to the weather, terrain, visibility, things in which the system needs to operate. There's a lot of aspects in the operational environment related to the area of operations. Is this something that is going to operate exclusively in total exclusion zones, or there will be an opportunity to operate in areas where the area of operations could be shared with non-combatants? There's rules of engagements, the skills of the systems, how the system interact with peers, which could be other machines or human operated machinery. Then there is the threat environment that the system is expected to operate within. Then there is the information environment. What happens with communications? Could communication drop? What happens with fundamental enabling technologies, such as satellite navigation and timing, and also electromagnetic spectrum, which may affect some of the sensors. In addition to that, we also specify the health of the system. There's some nominal health, but there's also limited skills that the system may have due to some faults. It could be in sensors and effectors. So all that is described in the operational concept document that Defense produces. Together with, they also provide industry with some reference missions. They're not specific missions, but there's some, look, these are some of the specific or examples of missions in which these systems will be operated. They also specified interfaces with human roles, and also contingency considerations and procedures, and sometimes very specific scenarios. So that's the operational concepts document that Defense provides to industry as to what is the intention of the system that they want to acquire. Then there's another document which is called the function and performance specifications. Here we have probably in the order of thousands of requirements that comes in the form of the system shall blah, 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 do this. And this is something that comes in addition to the operational concept documents that describes the context within which the system. And then sometimes this has changed name over time, but Defense also provides what is called the test concept document, that when Defense will accept the acquisition of a product, how will Defense will be doing the testing of that system. So that's all part of the need and a specification that usually comes from Defense to industry. Then industry starts from that input to execute a design. As Defense prepares these documents, you can really tell that underlying the preparation of the documents, there has been some legal considerations taken. Perhaps, maybe as Damien, you said, they could be made more explicit. So if you understand international humanitarian law, you can go through all the requirements and you can see which are the requirements that map to the international humanitarian law, but perhaps that could be more explicit. I think Defense puts a lot of effort into doing that, but sometimes it's not very explicit in there. But we receive a very comprehensive information on how the system ought to be designed. Then industry start doing the design. So we map those thousands of requirements into low-level requirements. and more the defense customers is asking industry to share the digital engineering practice so we can demonstrate the traceability of requirements to the requirements that defense set up, and tools that enables us, if you change a particular requirement at a lower level for the design of the system, what other requirements are impacted and how that traceability gets done. So this is something that industry shares with defense, and defense starting to put some frameworks in how they want industry to operate and share that information with them. Then we do verification and validation of requirements, and we do test and evaluation. Often defense also does developmental test and evaluation together with industry during the different stages of the development of the system. So we could be quite heavily involved in that with defense and also with external parties. Once we finish the design and the designs we're happy, industry is happy with, then comes the acceptance aspects of the design pipeline. This is where defense appoints the regulators. The regulators are part of defense that represents, for example, aspects of safety and cybersecurity of the system. In this case, industry needs to put forward what's called usually a safety case, where there's some safety claims, and there is a lot of evidence that needs to sustain that safety claim for the regulator to be able to approve the system in regard to safety. Defense also takes the system into their operational test and evaluation, and they do their independent test in operational conditions that will resemble how defense intends to use the system in theater. And at this stage, there's also the legal review as well conducted. And once all that is passed and is in place, then the system is deployed. Now, when the system is deployed, there is training on military personnel on how to use these systems. And there is something else which is called mission engineering, which is how defense designed the missions. Probably the US Department of Defense is the ones that they have a lot of interesting and most available information on a public webpage. So if you look for mission engineering with the US Department of Defense, you will land in a page that describes the mission engineering process. During the mission engineering process, context within that the system needs to operate for that particular mission, again, is set up. There are some measures of effectiveness, of performance, and safety that are set up. And there is a lot of simulation based with high fidelity models in order to assess that the system will satisfy rules of engagements as well as the military objectives. So once the mission engineering process is concluded, in the case of an autonomous systems, what comes out is a lot of mission data that the system ingests. That mission data is uploaded into the system. And again, there are checks that the system has the capabilities that are required to conduct those missions, and that the system is not being asked to do anything that is outside to the rules of engagement. So hopefully that provides you a little bit of an overview of all the design process that industry goes with defense before a system can be fielded. I think I'm going to drop it there. Yeah.
Thanks, Tristan. I especially like your point that we need to all speak the same language, and linking that to Kate's remark about the multidisciplinary expertise. Sometimes that can be quite difficult. So thank you for your presentation. To each of the speakers, thank you. I'm just looking at the questions which are already building up in the chat, and from those alone, I can see that your presentations have generated a significant amount of thought and discussion. I'm conscious of the time, so what I propose to do is to start from the top of the questions and see how far we go. And then to those who are happy for me to do so, if we do get to the end of our time without having answered your question, I'm very happy to answer the questions separately offline. And so if people are happy for me to do that, I can do so. But without any further delay, I will start. And Jessica, thank you. You were first question's quite early in the piece, and I have an answer, but I'm interested, Laurent. Jessica's first question refers to I guess the status of an AI-enabled decision support system and whether or not such system would be regarded as a method of warfare for the purpose of Article 36, therefore making an AI decision support system subject to a legal review. Do you have a comment about that?
Thank you, Damien, and thank you, Jessica, for the questions. Yes, I think it makes total sense to view the use of AI decision support systems as a method of warfare that therefore should be subject to legal review under Article 36 obligations for state parties to AP1. In terms of what does the the legal review looks like, I think there are two aspects that would need to be reviewed. First is the reliability of the system itself in terms of the recommendations or the assessment it provides to the users. So the system itself, but if it's a decision support system, it would be equally important to assess the system interactions with the user. Including assessing automation bias and those kind of problems, trying to test it in simulations where the personnel is put under stress, time constraint, etc., to see how the human would perform with the system using that method of warfare in that sense. So not only looking at the system, but really the interaction with the human, and that's maybe that's part of how you do legal review, of course, but that's particularly important, I think, for decision support systems. If I may, on the other questions, the next question of Jessica, how can state ensure compliance with the system behavior is not static? I think the first question, and I alluded to that in my presentation, is whether states should consider that a system whose behavior is not static should actually be lawful in the first place, because precisely there is a risk that any assessment that is being carried out at the moment of the legal review may no longer be valid if the behavior of the system change afterwards.
Thanks, Laurent. Moving on to the next question, Mitch King, two questions, one about the scalability of quality legal reviews and accountability. So I might have a quick response to that, and then Kate, I see you're smiling. I don't know if you want to contribute to that, but certainly the scalable adoption of legal reviews, I think, is an important issue. Whilst Article 36 on a strict reading might suggest that a single legal review is sufficient if it makes a determination prior to the use in armed conflict, I think the more sophisticated systems are, particularly those that are enabled by artificial intelligence, warrant a greater through life cycle legal review process, which would mean that that process would need to be scaled in various forms, interim, governance across both the development, but in particular during the use. And that partly goes to the second part of Jessica's question. Accountability is a really good point. I think one way in which accountability is possible is through states exchanging best practice. That initiative has started in the last couple of years, and so states demonstrating the existence of a formal legal process is a good step, and articulating how they go through that process is very helpful as well. That also encourages the compliance with the legal review obligation, which is far from universal. But also a good example is to make publicly available results of legal reviews, and at the moment, there's only one country I'm aware that does that. That's the Netherlands. So I think that's a sort of a gold standard in terms of accountability and transparency. Kate, did you want to add to any of that?
Sure. So one of the things that I think is helpful is to imagine, yes, you could have new laws, but also new means and methods of lawfulness. So I think sometimes the debate gets stuck in the need for laws, but often about the application of the existing laws is where we get an enormous advantage. And I think we're going to see the move from what I would consider the Victorian current means of doing legal reviews, right, which is pieces of paper and military lawyers that are always in short supply, having to go through this stuff as it gets more and more complicated. So we have to build the method of legal compliance and the means of legal compliance with the same alacrity as we apply to the actual technology itself. And it's actually the investment in enabling us to better get a handle on the parameters of these technologies used in their intended contextual use, so that all can upskill both in the legal considerations and to ensure that we actually build ways of updating these models and algorithms in simulations and in ways that can be understandable by the lawyers and the other different diverse stakeholders to quickly do whatever we need to do in an iterative basis to ensure that lawfulness is, constant and ongoing. And that's an opportunity for innovation in the application of law.
Two questions. I might address the first, and then the second one is directed to Laurent, and then I think that will draw us to an end. Apologies to all the rest who have questions still unanswered. Elle's first question was around how can Article 36 be applied in a preemptive way to curb development of weapons that threaten to violate IHL. So in particular, quantum sensing, neurotechnologies, etc. I think that is exactly the purpose of Article 36, is to determine legality in advance of the use. And so normally a legal review will come with one of three general responses. One, a weapon is lawful and capable of being used in compliance with IHL. Two, that the weapon is lawful, but certain uses must be restricted in order to mitigate the risk of unlawful use. And finally, three, a weapon is simply unlawful and cannot be used in any circumstances. And so depending on how those particular technologies are employed, then a legal review might result in one of those three responses. That's not to say, though, that response is static. It can change as dependent on the future use of the weapon. Laurent, the second question, how often do states fail their own legal reviews?
That's a very good question that I actually cannot answer for the reasons that you mentioned, Damien, is that states are not speaking much publicly about that. But I agree with you that the golden standard, as you said, that the Netherlands has of publishing them is what we would recommend states to do. And we in particular insist that or encourage states to do that when they would have a negative legal review, when they say this is actually prohibited. And that might raise less problem of classification if anyway the state doesn't want to decide not to develop it. But it would also be very useful in terms of telling other states how they interpret the law and saying, okay, this is something that we consider to be off limit from a legal perspective, developing those types of weapons. So specifically with a negative legal review, which I understand is not that often because precisely states try to shape the process in order to develop something that is lawful at the end of the way. So they probably have, multiple legal review that in a way drive the process towards something that is legal. But nevertheless, there will be situations where the answer or some aspect of the answer is negative, precisely in shaping what is being done, and that this could be more easily published probably. But that speaks also to the second question about an outsider actor overseeing the process. It's so much based on technologies that states would see as classified or even top secret. I mean, depending on the level of classifications, but that they are certainly not willing to have an external actor overseeing the process, even if I perfectly see the point of that being very helpful. But I don't think that states are ready to do that even within the process, which would be even much more, in a way, demanding in terms of transparency than publishing the result of the assessment.
Thanks, Laurent. And that does unfortunately bring us to the end of our time. I think the panel, if everyone could join me in thanking them for giving us their time and for the engaging discussions. Clearly from the volume of questions, thank you so much. Susan, any closing remarks?
Look, nothing too much further from me, Damien, other than to say thank you very much to everyone for your time, for your participation, and for the thorough and well-considered questions in the comments section here. I know Damien will relish responding to each and every one of those, and it'll be a terrific opportunity to continue the conversation well beyond today's presentation. We're going to get you away right on time now. Just a quick little advert for Article 36 Legal. I'd love you to continue remaining connected to these important conversations and these topics. You can do that through a couple of different ways. You can subscribe to a newsletter that's now available via their website. Follow the company page, Article 36 Legal, on LinkedIn if you're not already, and watch out for upcoming workshops, courses, training programs, and credentials online. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.